Thank you, Stair. Calling me a savior just plays right into my Catholic savior complex, so that's probably a bad move. But in any event, I'm delighted to start this three-part series with Network Nova tonight, and I'm really thrilled that the Women's Summit has decided to make this essential question of the rural-urban divide part of the summit. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into my presentation if we're ready for that. Are we good to go, Stair?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we are good to go. And just for everyone to realize that when the presentation comes up, it will take over your full screen, and you can then diminish it a little bit if you like. And you can also scroll it over a little bit to your left or right, depending on how much you want to see of Anthony's face and how much you want to see of the presentation.
So Stair and Anthony, would you like to do your introductory poll first?
Yes, let's please release the first poll. That'd be great.
Okay, everyone should be able to see the poll now.
There's a third question for you to scroll down after you answer the first two.
Jane, are you able
I'm
to see this
yes.
results?
Just want to make one comment in that maybe people want to use the scroll bar because a lot of people are answering the second question. So it makes me think that maybe they missed the question above it. So there's three questions. Do you live? Do you consider yourself? And then when you shower, is it usually? So for everyone that's on the call, please use the scroll bar. There are three questions. And we'll give you just another, I guess, 5 seconds here, and then we'll close it out.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I'll let you close it when you think
okay,
just about right, and then let's share it.
All right. So you should be able to.
So Anthony, do you want to comment on what we have here?
It's just good to see a diversity of folks. We've got an almost equal mix between people in rural areas and small towns on the one hand and people in or near cities on the other. That's great. Predominance of Democrats. We expected that with a subset of Democratic socialists and a few independents. Great to have all of those folks. And the shower question, you'll understand a little better why I was asking such a personal question when we get a little further into the presentation. So thanks all for that. I'm going to go ahead and jump in and start the presentation. So first of all, let's see, let's close out of the poll. Just to reinforce that this is the first of a three-part series. And the foundation that we're doing tonight, we'll be talking about the underlying causes, but the other parts of this three-part series are really important. So I'm hoping folks will consider coming back for the second and third part and maybe inviting others to join as well. So tonight we're really focusing on the underlying causes of the urban-rural divide and in a sense of Trumpism with the title, How Did We Get in This Mess? Next week, it'll be Wednesdays after tonight. Next week, we're going to focus on the Democrats, us, and our tendency to, as I say in the title, get tepid when perhaps we need to be bold and talk about a couple of particular things, what I call the myth of the middle, the phenomenon of incrementalism and other things. And then the third and final session, which is Wednesday, the 17th of June, is going to focus on, okay, we understand it a little better. How do we overcome this divide? It's a long-term process, but we'll talk about ways to change how we think about the issues, what we say, how we communicate, and also what we do. So that's the three-part series. I hope tonight whets your appetite and you decide to come back for more. So the big question to me, and I think for a lot of Democrats and liberals, progressives, is like, how the heck did we get here? How did we get to such heightened levels of polarization. So that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. And this is a combination of my experience and thinking with a lot of other really, really smart practitioners, activists, and authors is what has gone into this presentation. And there'll be a guidebook that's shared at the end that has lots of their components. So the first underlying cause, I would say the foundational cause, is that the economy just hasn't worked well for most Americans. We talk a lot about the top 1% or the top 1/10 of 1%, but the truth is that the top 20% have fared pretty well. But the bottom 80%, which is to say the vast majority of us, have not. And how do we know that? Well, there's a lot of ways to slice that pie, but here's a graph that helps explain it. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. At that time, there were 230 million Americans in the country. By 2016, more or less the present, the population had grown to 320 million. That's an increase of about 42%. Now, during that exact same period of time, our economy almost tripled in size. That's how much our population grew, but our economy, even adjusted down for inflation, almost tripled in size. When we say the economy has tripled in size, we're saying that there's almost 3 times as much money moving through the economy, 3 times as much goods and services being produced and sold. So if the population only grew a wee bit, the economy grew a great deal, something isn't right. Why aren't most of us better off? That's really the fundamental question, because if there's 3 times as much wealth and money moving through the economy and only 40% more people, most of us should be better off, but most of us are not. We all know about the horrific Tax Cut and Jobs Act passed in the beginning of 2017, and it made a bad situation worse. But the fact is that for most working class, poor, and middle class people in this country, for 40 years, wages have been stagnant, wealth has been either stagnant or declining. And that includes through 16 years of Democratic presidents. Robert Reich put it this way: the way it was before Trump brought us Trump. The way it was before Trump was an economy rigged for the benefit of the few, stagnant wages, socialism for the rich, and harsh capitalism for everyone else. A healthcare system whose co-payments and deductibles were out of control and still didn't cover 30 million Americans. And big money controlling our politics. So, you know, there's a lot we can pin on Donald Trump and the Republicans before him and during his time. There's plenty. And believe me, I am not saying that there's an equivalence between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the leadership of the Democratic and Republican Party. I'm not saying that at all. But the truth of this extremely concentrated power, political power, and extremely concentrated wealth is that in addition to Republicans, key Democrats like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama have enabled or exacerbated it. With Clinton, it was in a lot of respects, including the trade deals, NAFTA, and the World Trade Organization admission of China, but also the elimination of Glass-Steagall, which basically opened up banking to speculative derivatives and to the great crash of 2008. Obama's head of the antitrust division within the Federal Trade Commission let virtually every merger proceed, including Big Pharma, which then, of course, led to not only small businesses losing out, but to higher prices. So the truth is, if we want to win over more of our fellow Americans, we've got to own our own role in this mess. That antitrust stuff is no small deal. In rural areas, it's hit all aspects of the economy, but in rural areas, the concentration in the farm and food system is extreme. It is absolutely extreme, and the consequences for farmers in rural communities have been severe. Tyson and 3 other meat companies control about 85% of all meat processing. And when a few companies control it, of course, their goal is always to drive the costs down and get the best price or the best margin they can. And so that ends up putting farmers and rural people in situations of being part of an extractive system that's terrible for animals, terrible for the environment, and has these confined animal feeding operations that consumers hate. But many rural communities from Iowa to North Carolina have no choice. And when you have 4 companies controlling 85% of production, a chicken that might cost us $1.69 a pound today at the grocery store, that same chicken, the farmer who raised it and took on all of the risk and all of the debt for his facilities, his or her, is getting about 5 cents per pound as a contractor with Tyson or Purdue. So we have a rural economy that is in many places not primarily agricultural, although that's still always a feature, but a rural economy that's returning both poor wages to farm workers, but also poor return to farmers like Martin Miles on the right, my longtime friend and tobacco farmer from Lee County. Farm workers and farmers are getting hurt. So you have many things that are going on. When you have that kind of corporate control, you have the drying up of main streets across the country. So the second underlying cause flows from the first. We have this long-term economic decline that's hit people across this country, but in rural areas it's been particularly acute. And so that has helped to create this widespread anger against elites. Now, if you read Catherine Kramer's book, A Politics of Resentment, it's a brilliant, brilliant book where she talked to rural Wisconsinites over the course of several years. She found out that the people they identified as elites are basically city folks, liberals, to be sure, Democrats, academics and intellectuals. And their feeling was that these folks, these elites, were out of touch with their reality and did not care about them. And that this then, along with the bad economic situation, helps to foster what Catherine Kramer calls a politics of resentment. Trump's an expert at exploiting it. In fact, the Republican Party has been exploiting it for quite some time. Trump's a master at it with his relentless attacks on experts, scientists, government workers, government employees, intellectuals, academics. But putting Trump aside, we have to realize that while most of us on this call, most liberals, most Democrats, believe the scientists, the professionals, the experts, whether they're talking about COVID-19 or climate change, we ask ourselves, why don't these other folks? Why do so many people not believe them? And a significant part of it is because these experts that we embrace are, to many working people in rural areas, simply another kind of elite. Somebody that doesn't understand the plight of working folks. And also because the elites are not always right. And so they're probably right more often than not, but wrong enough that they can be exploited. So this has created this incredibly widespread resentment and this sense of anti-elitism that can be activated and exacerbated so quickly. There's another dimension to it too, which we'll talk about throughout this presentation, is that for a lot of folks, especially if I would say the older generation, but not just, they've come to believe that the government and the larger kind of media and cultural establishment are, and this is a quote from somebody who said this to me not that many years ago, that they're always telling us what to do, what to say and not to say, what to eat and not to eat, and how to live our lives, and we're just sick of it. So this sense from everyday working folks, and particularly I would say farmers and rural people, that this state apparatus and this larger culture doesn't get us, and they're always trying to tell us how to live our lives. Catherine Kramer's research in Wisconsin, when she was looking at the rise of Scott Walker, found that one of the sub-elements of this is that for a lot of rural folks, they defined real work versus desk jobs. And I'm not saying that this is fair or reasonable, or that people who work in an office 8, 10, 12 hours a day aren't working hard. But for working people in the countryside, this was a very important division. And that's where the shower question came in. She had people said to her, we shower after we go to work. But these folks with the desk jobs, they shower before they go to work. And that's kind of a defining difference. So for them, working hard, working with your hands, putting your body on the line is in many ways the definition of real work. And because more of the intellectual work, the so-called creative economy work, is happening in the city, it plays into the sense of it's a different understanding of work. I can tell you that during my campaign early on in March, I was cutting firewood because we heat with wood, and I encountered a young man who didn't know who I was and asked me what I was doing cutting wood. It was on a neighbor's property. And when he found out who I was and he saw me sweating and cutting firewood and splitting it and tossing it in my truck, his comment to me was, if my buddies could see you doing this, they'd all vote for it. So there was some sort of an embrace that because I was busting my butt, it was somehow more authentic work. So we've got, again, an economy that isn't working for most Americans, and particularly so in rural areas. We've got this widespread resentment of elites and kind of classifications of people as elites or real workers. And then we have this fact that many people believe that regulations don't help everyday people. Now think about this. Country people, whether they're farmers or fishermen or loggers or even miners, people's lives are much more intimately connected to the environment in the countryside. People in the countryside, often their occupation or their livelihood depends on a healthy ecosystem, okay? And yet, it's in the countryside that most people have this, what I've come to call regulatory aversion, the belief that regulations don't help the little guy, that they aren't necessary. Now, again, we can all say we have to have regulations, environmental, worker safety, health. We can cite countless examples of what the workplace was like before OSHA, what mines were like before the Mine Safety Health Administration. We know all that, right? But we're perplexed about why so many people in the countryside are against regulation. So I'm going to give you two examples. The first one comes from Arlie Hochschild, who wrote the book Strangers in Their Own Land, which we'll be talking about. She cites one of the rural Louisiana families that she came to know, and she was talking to a man who consistently voted at the state and federal level for people who promised further deregulation of the petrochemical and pesticide and plastics industry that were upstream and upwind from him. And he knew that those industries were hurting his health, his family's health, and killing the bayous where he had grown up. And so she said to him, why do you keep voting for people who want to further deregulate these companies when you know they're hurting you? And what he said was, look, if I spill a gallon of oil out of my boat, the regulators are all over me and I'm sure to get a big fine. But when the companies spill 100,000 gallons of oil in the bayou, nothing happens to it. Now, whether or not that's always true, we don't know, but we do know that that's a reasonable reservation about whether regulations are working for ordinary people or for the big companies. And similarly, the Upper Big Branch Mine, those of you in Appalachia know the story of Massey Coal Company in the Upper Big Branch Mine and the 29 miners who were blown up in a methane explosion in 2010. But what a lot of people don't know is that for the month prior to that explosion, Massey got almost 60 safety violations. For the year prior, they got over 500 safety violations, but nothing significant happened. And so they ended up feeling like the regulations simply don't protect everyday people. The fourth element of this kind of underlying cause is what Arlie Hochschild in her book called Strangers in Their Own Land, this sense. And again, I will share with you a reader at the end of this presentation that has references to the books I talk about, but also has much, much shorter articles by Arlie, by Catherine Kramer, and many others. But I couldn't encourage you more than to read some of these books because it just is a real deep understanding. She is a Berkeley PhD sociologist who spent 5 years among rural people in rural Louisiana. Got to know them well, they got to trust her, vice versa. And that was her conclusion, that these folks felt like strangers in their own land. And what she meant by that was that they felt displaced, they felt passed by, they often put the blame on other people without naming it, more than likely immigrants and people of color, because they felt that these other folks were butting in line, kind of taking their place. But this sense of being a stranger in their own land was also rooted in the extraordinary betrayal of the economy and politics, which had not helped them. So it fuels this culture of grievance, this culture of outrage and defensiveness. And my question for us, oftentimes on the left and in democratic circles, we hear those kinds of sentiments and we dismiss them. And we talk about white privilege, which now more than ever is such a clear and powerful part of the dysfunction in our society, the injustice in our society. There's no doubt about that. But when we take also legitimate grievances, legitimate senses of being displaced and being strangers in their own land, and we dismiss it solely as white privilege, what happens? What does that do in terms of fostering our understanding? Another take on this question of being a stranger in your own land comes from Sarah Smarsh, a wonderful thinker and author grew up in rural Kansas. Again, I couldn't recommend more her book, Heartland. She was the first person in her family to go off to college, and when she was at the University of Kansas, she started encountering mostly people that had no experience of growing up rural, no experience of farming or any of the other things in rural life. And this is what they said to her. She quoted them as saying that they hadn't heard anything like the stories she told of her growing up since they'd read The Grapes of Wrath. And she went on to say that they were telling her this in all seriousness, that they thought we, these rural folks, didn't exist anymore, when in fact we just existed in places they never went. So for many rural people, that's how they feel, that the big media outlets, the pundits and the politicians, the influencers, don't go to rural areas. They certainly don't live there, and they don't go there. And so the mainstream can seem very foreign and very alien to them. Another take comes from an author named Erica Edelson, who again I highly recommend, and we'll talk about her book. But is this sense of feeling besieged? Now, I know Kathy Cole's on this call, and I know there's other rural people on this call. Many of us in rural Virginia just a few months ago witnessed this phenomenon of Second Amendment sanctuaries being declared, where boards of supervisors, in some cases town councils, were presented with these petitions to declare that community a Second Amendment sanctuary, as if Second Amendment rights were under siege, which they certainly have not been. That swept Virginia and other rural places like wildfire. The vast, vast majority of rural boards of supervisors, in fact, passed Second Amendment sanctuary legislation. May not be anything with any particular teeth, but it was making a statement. And it comes from this sense of being under siege. In her book, Beyond Contempt, Erica Edelson quotes a woman named Christina, who identifies herself as growing up in a conservative rural household, but becoming more of a liberal as she matured. And Christina says, I know it's hard to believe that a member of the dominant race or religion of this country could honestly consider themselves a besieged underdog, but people really believe this. It's actually very easy to believe that your own small town or your own local religious community is an isolated pocket of sanity in a hedonistic liberal world. Now remember, with Sarah Smarsh's perspective on this, that as a rural person, as somebody who grew up in a family that was both farming and struggling as a working class family, she found that people in the city were like amused and amazed by her stories. They had no understanding. So this sense of being an alien in your own land can create for some people the sense of being under siege. Now the fifth cause that I want to talk about, and this we will get into much more in the second and third segments. We'll go into much greater detail, but it's important to bring it up now. Okay, so you've got an economy that isn't working for most Americans and certainly isn't working in most rural communities. You've got, with that long-term economic stagnation and the concentration of wealth in other places, you have rural people and working people who increasingly resent elites whom they consider to be highly educated liberals from the city, for the most part, and the media. You then have this sense of being strangers in their own land, and a kind of a broad resentment of government and a dislike and distrust of government regulations. You have all of these things happening. And then you have two political parties to choose from. Two parties. One of them, the Democratic Party, for at least 50 years prior, was generally identified as the party of the working class. But as we'll explore in the next section, our party, no matter how we cut it, has moved away from working people, symbolically, in our language, and in our policies. And that we've instead tended to embrace tech superstars. Now, I'm going to come back to this second element, which is this attitude of language and contempt that exacerbates that. But I just want to say, it didn't start with Barack Obama. It really started with Jimmy Carter, accelerated with Bill Clinton. But beyond our presidential standard bearers, the party as a whole has moved towards what Michael Lind calls the managerial overclass, towards well-educated, often elite-educated professionals. And so there's been a fundamental shift in the orientation of the Democratic Party. Along with that shift in the party has been increasingly commonplace, not from all of us for sure, but increasingly commonplace, contemptuous language. In Beyond Contempt, Erica Edelson has countless examples of this. And she talks about how to reframe things and move out of this contemptuous language. But one of the most popular Democratic sites is Daily Kos, Marcus Miletus, and he said after the vote that we should be happy for coal miners losing their health insurance because they're getting what they voted for. Paul Krugman, another well-known, relatively liberal economist, called the people who voted for Trump, many of them in the countryside, chumps and losers who basically destroyed their own lives. For my own part, I can't tell you how many times I have heard smart, thoughtful, kind, well-meaning fellow liberals consider this question of the rural divide and ask, why do these people keep voting against their own interests? In subtle and in not so subtle ways, we're often using language of contempt. And the last underlying cause, which in its own way is to a degree an outgrowth of the other five, but then becomes a contributor to the divide, is this myth in the middle, this centrist myth, and the incremental kind of policy it fosters. Now, I'm really going to focus on this in the second segment next week. I'm going to focus on the language issue, changing our language and changing other things in the third session on June 17th. So I'm just skimming over them. But I want to flag this because, again, if you're struggling and you're in a rural area and you've come to believe that a lot of people in the media and academia and the government are disrespectful of you, or at least don't understand your life and your needs, and then you're looking for how to vote and how to embrace a party, you're going to be looking at, for the most part, just two options. The Democrats have made a choice strategically, and they've done it again, I would say, in this election cycle, to move towards the middle. What Ian Haney Lopez does in his book, Merge Left, is he documents how, in fact, most people who are neither solidly left, like Bernie-type people, or solidly right, he thinks it's about 60% of the population, those people in the middle are not centrists. They're actually persuadable people that he documents hold both right-leaning views and left-leaning views, oftentimes on the very same issue. They might be confused about it. They might have contradictory feelings. They might just be unclear exactly what the heart of the issue is, but they'll oftentimes hold both views. And he found that what they're really looking for is not a position in the middle, that's sort of a lukewarm compromise between left extreme and right extreme, but they're looking for people who understand them and respect them, and then propose solutions that they think will address their problems and their needs. So the centrist myth contributes to the rural-urban divide oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, because we, the party of the working people, the party that's trying to refute and stop the Republican Party, tend towards policies that do not address the fundamentals of their problems and challenges and sound wishy-washy, lukewarm, and uninspiring to them. These are the 6 underlying causes, and in this urban-rural divide guidebook that I've assembled, you can get a kind of a deep dive by reading articles from about 20 different authors. Actually, I think it's about 24 authors. Some of my writings are in it, but many, many other people like Erica Edelson and Thomas Frank and Arlie Hochschild and others are in there. And it's organized basically along this same framework of how did we get here and the underlying causes. I believe that Stair is putting or has put the link into the chat box, but I'd encourage you to go there, whether you're coming back to the second session or not. I hope you will, but I really encourage you to go there because you can get a much deeper kind of understanding than what I've been able to provide in 30 minutes by looking through the guidebook. And because it's a series of articles rather than books, you can just bite off a little bit at a time and further your understanding. So that's my presentation for our first go around. And we have 25 minutes now for questions and conversation.
Thank you, Anthony. This has been really insightful. So I have been monitoring the chat box, and if anyone would like to raise their hand and ask a question or put it in the chat box, we will be there for you. Okay, so I've got myself in the gallery view here, so I can see those people who are here. Thank you all for coming tonight. And I have put in the link to Anthony's guidebook. Is there going to be a recording of the session? Yes, there's going to be a recording of the session.
Stair, if I could just add that if anybody's on the call tonight and knows of somebody that might be interested and might want to join us in 1 or 2 of the following weeks, it would be terrific if they could go and listen to the recording, because the second and third week kind of take for granted the underlying causes. I'll review them very briefly, but they sort of take it for granted. So it's something of a foundation for the next 2 sessions. So I'd encourage people who are thinking of inviting other folks to come in to make sure that they encourage them to go to the Network Nova site and watch this.
Okay, so Anthony, so Mary Farrell says, what brought you to this work?
Oh, happenstance of sorts. I worked in Eastern Kentucky. I went to school at the University of Kentucky. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, and I ended up doing strip mine reclamation in Eastern Kentucky. And after I got a master's degree in economics and rural development, I came back to Appalachia in Southwest Virginia in 1985. So I've done a lot of different things, running nonprofits, business. I've farmed for 25 years, but this particular thing, this urban-rural divide, really it's come out of 2 congressional campaigns and a lot of work on the ground, and feeling like unless we can understand this and approach it differently, much of our collective hope to build a more just and sustainable world is really undermined by this divide. The truth is that rural areas, as disenfranchised as they are economically and politically in many respects, also at the same time have a disproportionate amount of electoral power because of the way we do the Senate and the Electoral College. And so unless we can win the hearts and minds of more rural people and really begin to change this, demographics alone are not going to get people where we want in terms of climate change and economic equality and racial justice. So I've come to think that this is not just a rural issue, this is a foundational issue towards building a better world, and that's why I've kind of become preoccupied with it.
Thank you. Families divided, rural and suburban relatives distrust each other, hardly want to spend time together because of differences. Suggestions on a family level.
Well, I'll get into that much more in our next two sessions, but for now, I'll say this. Number one, just be conscious of your language. So contemptuous language, from the standpoint of the country folks that I know, born and raised country, is not just kind of deliberately condescending language or deliberately mean-spirited language. It's not just that. It's also too much talk. A lot of farmers and working folks like people who say things directly, succinctly, simply. And when we talk contextually and we talk a lot and we try to find and thread the needle just right, it oftentimes alienates people who just want to know what you're thinking. And so one thing I'd say is be empathetic, but also be clear, be direct. Don't talk around things and don't talk too much. Second thing I'd say is try to overcome the impulse you might have to think that something is wrong with these people, that they just don't get it, that all they need is more education. If we could just get them off Fox News and Breitbart and get them listening to NPR and Democracy Now!, everything would be fine. Because the truth is, not all of it, but plenty of their underlying skepticism of liberals and resentment of elites comes from a real place, a real foundation of well-deserved frustration and anger. If we know that, then we stop trying to convince people that they just don't get it and start trying to really understand where they're coming from. And the third thing I'd say is don't just resort to elites. Don't say to somebody if they're skeptical about climate change, well, 97% of all scientists say that change is wrong. That's persuaded the people it's going to persuade. It's not going to persuade the people that are not now persuaded. You need to instead try to understand why they're skeptical about whether climate change is real or whether human beings have a role. And then try to see if there's something in their experience that you can work with there. But just resorting to the experts, I'm telling you, it ain't doing it. It plays right into their sense that you're talking down to.
Interested in the differences between the rural working class and the urban working class. How are their problems similar or different?
Yeah, well, a lot of similarities, because the urban working class, both people of color and white working class people in urban areas, have suffered mostly from the same bad policies. Rural areas have specifically rural policies, often through USDA and some others, that can either help or make things worse. But overall, our tax policy, which has increasingly given low rates to the wealthy and to corporations, has hurt working people. Our labor policy, our trade policy, our healthcare policy, they've really hurt working class folks in cities and the countryside alike. There's plenty of people who are trying to work to make connections between the urban working class, and particularly people of color, and rural working class, and I think that's incredibly important and critical work. What tends to happen in rural areas, I think rural people generally recognize that working class folks in the cities also are getting screwed. They don't think working class people in the cities are living the high life.
Yeah.
But their potential allegiance with working class people in the city is kind of interrupted or precluded by the sense that the cities are the places where the elites are, the people who talk different, who tell me I'm eating the wrong foods, the people that are always kind of shoving a particular sort of lifestyle down my throat. So cities have come to represent a certain kind of person. And so the working folks in New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington and Seattle, which is the bulk of the people in those cities, tend to be sort of overlooked by rural people because they're equating urban people with elites. That's a specific piece of work we need to do to undo.
That's quite interesting. Do you see any differences in the younger versus the older generations in these attitudes, or like the rural perspective?
Somewhat. Um, both the polls, the survey data, and my own experience indicates that younger people, let's say millennials or younger in rural areas, are um, less fixed in this rural urban divide and all the underlying causes, more open to some critique of their own perspective and their own communities, and so more generally open. But it isn't just a generational thing, because there are plenty of young people, more men than women, but plenty of young people in the countryside that also have this sense of being besieged, that have this sense of defending their rights, whether it's their rights to their heritage as they perceive it, their rights to their um, guns, whatever it is. That's by no means just a phenomenon among middle-aged and older people. Plenty of young people feeling that way as well.
Yes, that sounds. One might mention that movies and TV have promulgated the idea that city folk look down on folks in the so-called heartland who, to believe the films, had the real wisdom. Get a look at the chick flicks.
So for sure, Hollywood has not helped, and even sometimes documentaries that are much more thoughtful can still do a fair bit of lumping and stereotyping of rural people. But so yeah, I think absolutely, and Appalachia particularly feels um, dismissed and dissed by movies and the media. But it's more than just Hollywood. It certainly is, even though that has exacerbated it. It's the sense that the elites, again, from the media, from academia, from government agencies, only come to the countryside either around elections or when there's a particular crisis or problem. And so because they sort of fly in and fly out, there's a lack of understanding. When people like Arlie Hochschild spent weeks and weeks and weeks over the course of 5 years in rural Louisiana, when Catherine Kramer did the same thing in rural Wisconsin, she won their trust because of her consistent presence over a long period of time. And so they told her things, both of those women, things that they probably wouldn't have shared with somebody who just popped in for a town hall meeting. They really had to build trust, and trust is such a critical issue. It's a critical issue for all of us. I would suggest that it's even more of a critical issue in rural communities.
So how do suburban urban people get to know people in rural Virginia? We live in different worlds and our paths do not cross, yet we're connected and working against each other. Connected, how can we connect? So thank you,
Again,
Heidi.
Sure. I would suggest, first of all, reading this guidebook. I really would, because you will hear rural voices and voices for people who have really spent time and studied and examined it. If you read 50% of it or 100% of it, I honestly think that most suburban and urban people would have a far deeper understanding of the complexities and of how we got to where we are. So it's my little book. It's free, but I'm suggesting it because I think that's one thing you can do. It's a practical and relatively easy thing. Some people have taken steps, and you may have heard of some of this on NPR, where liberals from the city have facilitated a direct connection with conservatives, sometimes religious-based conservatives, from the countryside. NPR ran a story about this a few months ago. People from, I think it was Boston, who developed essentially kind of a ongoing exchange relationship with people from rural Kentucky. And the Bostonians went to Kentucky and spent time with those folks, and the Kentuckians went to Boston, and they developed a lasting friendship that didn't entirely change opinions on all sides, but definitely developed a fundamental layer of trust and empathy. If you want to try to facilitate something like that, there are organizations that are beginning to do that. That's a big deal. Not everybody's going to do that, but I think that's a really interesting way to get to know people. The other thing you can do in a much more practical way is, if you don't already do it, I'm sure a lot of you do, is start getting to know your local farmer. Get to know your local farmer. That doesn't mean just shopping if they sell at a farmer's market or if they've got an online stand under these conditions, but it means actually seeing if you can go out and visit the farm and spending time with them and learning what that experience is about. You could do the same thing with your fishermen if you live close to the coast. There are now community-supported fisheries in different parts of the East Coast where you can buy into that, but you could also then begin to understand, because fishermen very often have similar perspectives to farmers, ranchers, and loggers. They don't trust environmentalists. It's this crazy thing where the people who most need a healthy, thriving environment don't trust environmentalists. Don't just dismiss their distrust, but try to understand where that comes from. And I would say by going out with the fisherman, with the farmer, even with a logger, you might begin to learn.
Anthony, I love this kind of getting back to the real land and all this. And I think that this has given us an opportunity in the last 2 months to do that. What do you think are 3 things to avoid saying? Someone wanted to, yes, 3 words or phrases to avoid at all cost. How about that?
3 words or phrases. Well, so I'll start with the one I've already mentioned, which is when you're amongst your own people, your own Democratic committee, maybe your own indivisible group or Our Revolution or Network Nova or whatever it is, stop saying, what's wrong with these people? Why do they keep voting against their own interests? And if somebody else says it, and if you've read some of the guidebook, then help them understand that for an awful lot of these folks that appear to be voting against their own interests, they're not clear that anybody has their interests. And so they may be casting a vote for other reasons because they don't see Democratic politicians and liberals as having their interests. So number one, when you're in your own circles, please try to stop saying that and challenge it if somebody else says it. The second thing I would say is coming back to what I call language of the concrete. So we're going to talk about this in much more detail in the final segment. We're really going to be there's a whole portion of that that's about changing our language and 4 key principles around that and how to do it in a way that's going to much more resonate and connect with rural folks. But I can tell you that in general, rural people prefer the concrete to the abstract. They prefer the particular to the general. So any way that you can be concrete, any time that you can talk in specifics, in particulars, whether it's telling a story, giving an example, whatever else, that is just much more of a door opener than speaking at 30,000 feet in general terms or speaking abstractly. People want concrete.
Okay, let's see. So many of us engage in political practices that seem to expect a one-shot approach to convince voters to vote for X equals current canvassing protocols. Sounds like we need to be building relationships with folks with different beliefs, positions. How do we do this?
Well, again, I hate to keep saying more to come in the future sessions, but I will tell you that I did a training with the folks in Martinsville and Henry County back in February. It was a half-day training kind of modeled on what we've talked about tonight and what we will be talking about over the next few weeks. And one of the things that we discussed that seemed to really catch fire for the folks in Martinsville and Henry County, we talked a lot about language, we talked a lot about policy, talked a lot about owning the mistakes of Democrats, but we also talked about actually doing work in your local community with your Democrat or liberal or progressive or indivisible or Our Revolution hat on. That local groups of liberal-leaning people, however you identify yourselves, what if we started taking on significant, tangible projects in the communities, either where we live or in the neighboring ex-urban rural communities, so that we're not just showing up when it's canvassing time, trying to persuade people to vote for a certain person or vote a certain way on an issue, but we're actually committed to making a difference in those communities. And many of you, I'm sure, are doing that. I have no doubt about that. Liberal people do good work. But what if, as the Fairfax County Democratic Committee or the Northern Virginia Our Revolution chapter, what if, as those groups, you researched and developed in partnership with some local rural folks, including Republicans and Trump supporters, you started a project that actually could make a significant difference in people's lives. It might be related to food and farming and healthy food. It might be related to healthcare. It might be related to affordable housing. It might be related to land use. But whatever you do, if it's a tangible project that you have your name on and you start seeing some results that make a difference in people's lives, it might begin to change the perception of Democrats as elitists who don't care about us, liberals who just don't have a clue about our lives, and so they run roughshod over us and are always telling us what to do. We can change that narrative partly through understanding and definitely partly through language, but also by making sure that the work we do in communities is concrete and tangible, and then we don't have to make a big show of it, but if we do it with knowledge that we're doing it as Democrats, as progressives, as liberals, eventually that's going to start to wear down the negative perceptions of folks like us in those communities.
Anthony, we've got a couple of questions. We've got one question about religion, and I'm trying to pull it up here. And we've also got another question about climate change. When talking about climate change, rural folks want to know how it affects them right now, not their grandchildren. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think that may be generally true. I don't know if that's an interesting assertion, and it may be true. I don't have enough data or information to say if that's the case. I would say this, and this is true for a lot of rural people and a lot of people who aren't rural. If you've been kind of beaten down for a long time, if you've been hanging on by a thread, if your economic and financial situation is full of risk with no security, and if your life is hard, health-wise, family-wise, then something like climate change, something that to many of us is this gargantuan existential issue, can seem like one more thing, one more threat, one more problem, but it's in part of a long line and a long list, and so they may not have that sense of urgency, because for them and for their kids and their grandkids, the world ain't looking so hot anyway. So a hotter climate or a changing climate might not seem like just more than one other thing. So that could be where, if it's true that rural people tend to talk about climate change more in terms of whether or not it's impacting them now rather than looking down the road, that might be some of where it's coming from. Their fortunes aren't so hot, their kids' fortunes don't look good, and so they're putting that together. I would like to say one other thing about climate change. What a number of us have been working on is trying to find a common ground with farmers. Farmers are very skeptical of climate change, but farmers have mostly been vilified by the environmental movement. Mostly when the environmental movement talks about, and I'm generalizing here, but mostly when we in the environmental movement talk about farming, agriculture, and climate change, we talk about farming as one of the biggest contributors to climate change. We talk about all the net greenhouse gas emissions. And oftentimes it's couched in terms of, we got to stop eating meat. We've got to stop eating meat because meat is the single biggest problem. If that's the way we continue to talk about climate change to rural people, we ain't getting nowhere. We are solidifying the divide and the walls. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if we go to ranchers raising cattle and dairy cows and sheep and goats, and we go to farmers raising produce and grain and saying, we want to invest in your farms to improve the health of your soil, because we know that when your soil's healthy, your farm's healthy, your animals are healthy, your crops are healthy. and your farm is less vulnerable. And we also know that healthy, carbon-rich soil pulls carbon out of the atmosphere where we have too much, and it stores it in the ground where we don't have enough. So what if we start refocusing our climate change advocacy for rural communities on this idea of passing the public policies and making investment to help farmers actually adopt the practices, if they're not already doing it, that sequester carbon and make their farms healthy. It's a total win-win, and then we're going to farmers as allies rather than as adversaries. And they did this in Wisconsin, in Washington State just very recently when they passed soil health carbon sequestration legislation. Their first attempt was led by the environmental movement. They didn't try to bring in farmers, and what did they get? They got opposition. Then they started listening and talking to farmers, and by the end of the day, they passed progressive legislation on soil health and carbon sequestration, and they had the support of the Farm Bureau and the Washington State Dairy Association. Those are very conventional ag groups, and they won them over by focusing on that part of climate change.
So jumping back to sort of the nitty-gritty is also this whole concept of how rural people see their environment. That's another big sub. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. So let me just, right. So let me jump in here.
The preview of that is that rural people tend to see the environment from a livelihood perspective rather than a perspective of protecting it from people. They see it from a perspective of living in it. And we'll talk about that in a lot of detail next go round.
Do you see differences in religious beliefs and practices in rural versus urban? If so, what impact do you think that has on political views?
Well, you know, the religious spectrum in rural areas is also very broad. There are very liberal, progressive religious congregations and religious people, whether Christian or Muslim or Jewish or some other faith. We have the full spectrum, but the biggest churches and the most influential churches are politically conservative churches. And those churches have, for the most part, bought in to the spectrum of complaints that I've laid out here. They've bought into the idea that there is a dominant liberal culture that is trying to change the way people live their lives, that is opposed to more traditional and conservative values and the relationships and the mores that flow from that. And so while we have the full spectrum, there's I think no question that in Southwest and Southside Virginia and for much of rural America, the dominant religious belief, the most powerful and influential, are very, very politically conservative. And again, I think churches play an outsized role in elections, whether for the presidency or for Congress or even state legislatures. I don't think we can change people's perspectives by confronting them in the pews or by trying to change the perspective of pastors. I think when we begin to embrace this idea that there are real underlying causes, people have good reason for these feelings, and then we figure out the strategies to change the perceptions and change our own approach, that will eventually trickle into the pews. But I don't think that we can make much progress by actually confronting this kind of right-wing and sometimes even white supremacist ideology that flows through some of our rural churches.
So possibly in conclusion here, I just want to say that we've had a few comments from the Louisa County Dems and another Dem group here. I'm just scanning here. And they're reaching, you know, they are reaching out. So thank you for doing that. Yeah,
yes,
so there's a Rockbridge project and a Louisa County project. Thank you.
So I would love to hear what it is that they're doing. So my email is in the guidebook, but it's also just my last name, Flaccavento, ruralscale, ruralscale.com. Anybody who's didn't get their question answered, or who is working on trying to overcome the divide in different ways in their own community, I would love to hear from you. And I'd love to hear from you before next week, because maybe I'll ask you to, maybe I'll feature an example of some of the work going on before next week's session.
Thank you, Anthony. I am trying to once again post your guidebook in the chat. There it goes. Okay, so once again, I posted the guidebook in the chat, and thank you, Anthony. Do you want to have closing statements, or?
I'll just say again, thank you all for being part of this. If you got something out of it and you think it's useful, please do two things: spread the word to other folks and encourage them to view the first session. And please come back, because the whole process, it won't be very fruitful if you only go to the first one. It'd be a lot better if you can make it through to the others. So hope to see many of you back, and new faces as well. Thanks.
Oh, and we have a final poll. Anthony, we have a final poll.
Oh, we forgot about our final poll.
Let's
Yes.
do our final poll. Let me launch it. Okay, let's see. Okay, so
All right,
so
I went ahead and launched it.
Thank you, Lane. Thank you, Jane. Okay, so here's our final poll. Let's go ahead and do that. We still have 56 people online. So thank you all for coming tonight.
I'm not seeing the poll.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who is that? Who's speaking up here?
I mean, kind of take a look at your menu a little bit. Depends on the sure other people
Yeah.
are filling it in.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'll keep looking. Thanks.
So
yeah,
keep looking.
I think that what happens is that these things pop up, and if you have other windows in front of them, then you can't see them.
It's
I
just
know
right. The poll.
it's called a closing poll. It should be right in
questions.
front of everybody. It's
But
two questions.
right?
Two
Only
questions is
Yes,
all. That's
yes.
right.
Great session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everyone. It does look like we have a nice poll. I'll go ahead and end the poll. Whoops, somebody ended it before me. And we're going to share the results, and here are the results. So, mostly confirmed, improved your understanding, and everyone's coming back. So, that's fabulous. Thank you all. Good night.
Yes,
Anthony,
thank you.
please say anything.
Do we
else.
use the same number to come back?
Yeah, now it's good. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Probably
you.
not the same number, right?
No, and I will contact everyone in this session and thank them for coming and give them the address for the next one.
Thank you.
I don't think he can see me.
Okay, so we want to stop the recording
Yep.
and stop the Facebook Live.